Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest this week, Lord Frost. David, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
It's good to have you on this strange, historic day. So I'm speaking to you the day after the UK election, and it's very, very interesting. So Labour has got 412 seats, which is a landslide, as some people are referring to it. We can talk about how much of a landslide it is, I think. And the Conservatives are down to 121 seats, which is, I think everyone can agree, really, really, really bad. And it seems to me one interesting thing about today, it seems to me, is that no one is really happy, apart from Nigel Farage, perhaps. But the Tories aren't happy, of course. Your party is not happy because they've just had a real drubbing. Labour doesn't seem particularly happy, despite its landslide, because everyone is picking holes in the landslide and asking, are they there on the back of people's enthusiasm, or are they there more because the Tories have collapsed? So there's that question hanging over Labour. So it's a strange day, and I wanted to start off by asking you how you feel about today. What was your response to the election? I guess on one level you weren't particularly surprised, but how have you felt about the results and the fallout?
Well, as you say, I've been predicting this for some time, so I wasn't particularly surprised by the final result. I feel, gloomy, I guess, that what we all hoped would not come to pass has nevertheless come to pass. But there you are. Worried about what might come, and concerned that the Conservative Party draws the right lessons from what's happened. There's a lot yet to reflect on, obviously, but it's not a good day.
So what have you made of, is it a worse day than you were expecting? As you say, you've been predicting a pretty bad situation for some time. Some of the polls suggested an even worse situation for the Conservatives. I mean, the polling was all over the place in the run-up to this election. There were some polls saying the Conservatives could be down to, just a handful of seats and would be utterly destroyed. So they haven't been that badly impacted on as some of the predictions suggested they might be, but it is still nonetheless bad. Is it as bad as you thought it would be? Is it worse? What's your sense about, and within the party itself, what is people's feeling about the result? Is it as bad as they thought? Is it worse than they thought?
I mean, beyond a certain point, it kind of hardly matters. Your ability to do anything has been weakened to such an extent, below a certain level, that it doesn't really matter how bad it was. It was pretty bad. I think, there is one of the effects that this proliferation of polls has been to socialize some of the dreadful figures. We've all got used to the idea that the Conservative number was going to be very low. If you said at the start of the year that we were going to score 120 seats in a national election, I don't think anybody would have believed you. In fact, I know people didn't believe you, because when I was associated with a poll back in January that predicted we get 160-something seats, scorn was poured on it. Yeah, here we are. So I think we in an odd way, we've all got used to thinking that these low figures were to be expected. And the fact that it hasn't been the very lowest means that people are taking false comfort from it, or some people are taking false comfort. The truth is, we got 14 million votes in 2019, and last night we got under 7 million. We've lost half our votes, and that is bad. There's no other way of looking at it.
That is the starkest way to put it, and you're right. That is bad, and there is no other way of looking at it. Before we get on to where the Tories went wrong, where they might go right again, even whether they're capable of going right again. Before we get on to that, I want to ask you about our new government, our new overlords, to whom we must all now bow down. Starmer has a huge majority. He's in charge of the country. He can do pretty much anything he wants. What's your reading of Labour's result? Because it's a conflictual situation, I think, because on the one hand, they have got a very large number of seats. On the other hand, it is becoming increasingly clear that they haven't been swept to power on anything like a huge wave of public enthusiasm. And in fact, Labour's vote hasn't changed a great deal since 2019, 2017. Because of our system, because of the way things work, because of the way that Reform stood against the Tories in certain seats, because of all that, Labour has a huge number of seats. What's your reading on what has been referred to as the Labour landslide?
Well, you're right. The Labour vote has not changed that much over the last couple of elections. In a way, it's been a bit like the by-elections, where the Labour vote hasn't gone up, but our vote has collapsed. And that's, again, what's happened at the general election level. And in a first-past-the-post system, obviously, that gives them a huge number of seats. I think, once again, it almost doesn't matter. They've got 400 plus seats. They can do whatever they want. And I think, again, some Conservatives taking false comfort from the fact that the vote hasn't gone up and the wave of enthusiasm is not that great. Once you're in government, once you've got all the levers of government, once you've got the civil service working for you, it's very easy to control the environment, to control the agenda, to get a grip, to shape things as you wish. And I think the Tories have probably we've forgotten what the difference between government and opposition really is. So, okay, no doubt he'd rather have had the 44% or whatever it was at the start of the election. But nevertheless, as you say, he's got a huge majority. He can do whatever he wants. And I'm sure he will. The truth is we don't really know what Labour are going to do beyond a very broad brush approach. I think they're going to find it very hard to raise tax and spending. The country's taxed out. So they're going to resort to regulation, nannying of all kinds. They're going to double down on the culture war. And they are going to adopt a more relaxed approach to demands from the EU. And beyond that, I think it's quite difficult to foresee the detail.
I think that's a very good analysis of what Labour is likely to do, or the shape of what they're likely to do. I did want to ask you whether you think government will now work more efficiently, even if it works efficiently in a direction that people like you and I would disapprove of in terms of the issues that you've just outlined there. Because one of the striking things over the past day or so has been the celebratory tone amongst sections of the civil service, the Whitehall blob. There is a palpable relief that they've now got rid of this elected party, the Tories, that they didn't agree with on some issues, who they tried to block in some cases, tried to block some of the policies that the Conservative government of the time wanted to bring in. It does seem as though the blob was one of the problems that the Conservative Party faced when it was in government. Do you think now the blob will come to heel, I guess, and start to do what it's supposed to do, even if it ends up enacting policies that a great number of people won't like very much?
Yes, probably is the answer. I'm only a partial believer in the existence of a blob. I think what you have is a civil service that is kind of broadly, probably even centre-left exaggerates it. It's kind of culturally liberal, a bit left-leaning, maybe a bit Blairite, a bit Brownite in places. And obviously there are lots of individuals who think different things, but that's the tone, basically, that's set. And so I just think they're going to feel more comfortable. The great trauma there's been over the last few years about international law, the ministerial code, all this sort of parastatal kind of Platonic guardian's view of what government should be like. I think Labour are just going to feel much more comfortable with that. They're going to feel more culturally attuned with the way the civil service works. So I just think it's going to be easier and more relaxed for them. I don't think that's a kind of conscious decision by the civil service to block the Conservatives and make life easier for Labour. I think it's just that that's the way they see the world.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Conservative Party, where they went wrong, what they might do next. I think you're right to counsel against false comfort, and I have seen a little bit of false comfort amongst certain Conservative Party supporters. taking comfort in the fact that their drubbing wasn't as terrible as some pollsters predicted, and also in the fact that Labour's landslide is a little bit hollow once you dig into it and dig into the numbers. I think it's wise not to take those kind of false comforts. But I wanted to ask you, if we work our way backwards, I wanted to ask you what you thought, firstly, of the election campaign that the Tory party run. I saw you raising criticisms about almost an element of arrogance in parts of the Conservative Party campaign, where there was this presumption, well, we are the rightful right-wing party. You should only vote for us. You shouldn't vote for any of these other movers and shakers on the right, primarily Reform. There was that arrogant tone. How do you think they did in the election campaign itself? Obviously, the result wasn't good. What was the campaigning like?
I mean, so many things went wrong with the campaign. I think it's been a dreadful campaign generally from both sides. I mean, the level of serious discussion of serious issues, the many, many big problems facing the country barely being touched on. This description of it as the TikTok election, Ed Davis stunts, all this sort of stuff. I mean, I don't think I can remember a campaign where actual politics has been discussed so little, and I guess everybody is to blame for that. I think that probably played against us because, for all the mistakes that I think Rishi Sunak made in strategy over the last couple of years, and the I wouldn't have started from here problem, I still think our best approach was to show that we had the most sort of serious, reality-attuned set of prescriptions in this election. That, even though we'd made mistakes, we were going to be serious about the public finances. We were going to be serious about immigration. There was a sort of seriousness there. And unfortunately, we just chose not to kind of fight on that territory very much. We chose to focus on peripheral things, the national service issue, the doubling down on pensioners' payments, all this sort of thing. And I just think it didn't play to our strengths. It made life difficult for us. It underlined the fact that we didn't have a record that we felt particularly comfortable defending. And obviously we made some unforced errors like the D-Day and the dreadful betting scandal. So all this came together. I think a better run campaign, and we might not have been in quite so difficult a situation. Who knows how many seats it might have made a difference to, but certainly some. I do think the reform issue and the way we treated them has backfired on us. Maybe it's because I've not spent all my life in the Tory party, so I don't feel the emotional commitment that a lot of colleagues do to it. But I do think there was a sense of a self-righteousness about the campaign, a sense that, as you say, we were the only people who rightfully occupied the right of centre. Our defeat is really the fault of reform. You'll hear people arguing rather than our own mistakes. And I think what that shows is a disdain for the electorate. We think the electorate can't make their own mind up. It can't make its own judgments, and they should just go with the traditional pattern of voting. And politics isn't like that anymore. You've just got to win the argument, and we failed.
We know that many of you would like to become your own boss. And while starting your own business can be incredibly liberating, taking that first step is always the most difficult part. Luckily, there's a way to make the leap a whole lot easier, and it sounds like this. That's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the groundbreaking all-in-one commerce platform that can help you make your big idea a reality. Shopify supports millions of up-and-coming business owners like you all over the world. Whether you trade in fishing hooks or second-hand books, Shopify simplifies how you sell goods both in-store and online. Getting your new business off the ground has never been this hassle-free. That's because Shopify brings your entire business under a single digital dashboard. That means all your everyday tasks, from managing orders to taking payments, can all be done in one place. Basically, Shopify covers the basics so that you can stay focused on your customers. Shopify also sets up your business on those all-important social media platforms from Facebook to TikTok. Wherever your customers are, Shopify will help you connect with them. Shopify is all about helping you shape your business as you see fit. Its simple customization options will help you create a unique, engaging brand, and Shopify's award-winning business courses will help you stay competitive in crowded markets. Whether your goals are big or small, Shopify will give you just what you need to reach them. So what's stopping you? If you're looking to become truly independent, get started with Shopify today. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/Brendan. That's all lowercase. Shopify.co.uk/Brendan to take your business to the next level today. Shopify.co.uk/Brendan.
You mentioned a couple of issues there that I did want to get your views on, which was the D-Day scandal and the betting scandal, which came in fairly quick succession, and both of them hurt Rishi's campaign a lot, I think. I want to get your views on what they tell us about the 21st century Conservative Party, because when they first blew up, I thought, oh, here we go, the media making a mountain out of a molehill and trying to land anything they can on the Tory party. But then I thought, actually, both of them were pretty indicative of problems within the political class. I mean, to leave a D-Day commemoration, the 80th anniversary, no less, early for a media interview probably does tell us something quite important about the contemporary political class's attitude to the history of the country, to the people who fought for this country, to the military and so on. I think it probably tells us something quite important. And then the betting scandal, the fact that you had certain members of the Conservative establishment responding to news of revelations of an election by popping down to their bookies and putting on a flutter in order to try and make a bit of money probably is also quite revealing. I wonder if those two scandals, even though they came and went relatively quickly in the general 24-hour rolling news cycle, I wonder if they're quite indicative of problems within the Conservative Party that some people in the Conservative Party might not really want to address.
Yes, I think they are in their different ways. I think the D-Day scandal, I mean, if it was really a scandal, it was definitely a mistake. It showed that, as you say, I think the kind of resonance that a lot of people in this country still clearly, rightly feel about our achievements in the Second World War, and kind of what that symbolizes about our world role. That we've always tried to stand up for certain sets of principles, however imperfectly, and the Second World War was a big part of that. And failing to kind of show proper respect to that, I think it is hard to imagine the Conservative Party of 20, 25 years ago making that mistake. It was also revealing of actually what I think was just generally terrible organisation of the campaign and unforced errors. I mean, what compounded it was the fact that Keir Starmer stayed till the end. And it's very surprising to me that somebody in the team around the then PM didn't say, hang on a minute, if Starmer's staying, shouldn't we be? And I don't know. Obviously, I don't know whether that question got raised or not, but it was an organisational mistake not to spot that and give Starmer a free run. So that's so much on that. The betting scandal, I think. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what the scandal is here, obviously. And one of the things I found surprising in passing is the very secretive, restrictive way in which the Gambling Commission appears to work, and the constraints that are around the kind of information we're allowed to give out and talk about what it's doing, which I find very strange but symbolic of the way the state works nowadays. If we don't really know what happened, obviously, but if people in the know in the Conservative campaign about the 4th of July went out and betted on that with inside information, I think that is really shocking. I think that is a revelation of a kind of sort of moral turpitude, really, a failure to see what was right and how it was going to look to people, and a failure to have a kind of internal constraint that says, hang on a minute, should I really be doing this? And I was really quite appalled by it. Of course, we don't know the facts. Let's see exactly what happened. Maybe it doesn't matter now. If people betting on their own result, well, that just seems odd to me. It isn't necessarily corrupt, but it's just quite weird. So the whole thing just is odd. I think it contributed to this, both in their different ways, contributed to this feeling that the Conservative Party had somehow got complacent, lost its way, got too used to the trappings of power, and needed to be given a bit of a kicking. And that's exactly what's happened, obviously.
Yeah. In relation to the substance of the election campaign, or the lack of substance of the TikTok campaign, in relation to the Conservative Party's lack of substance, or their inability to put forward convincing or substantial arguments to the public, what do you think was underpinning that failure? I mean, on the one hand, it seems to me that on the one hand, it's because there are some things they haven't managed to do. So, for example, the levelling up agenda is just not very substantial. It doesn't seem that they've done much on that front, even though it was one of the great promises of 2019 election in particular, when lots of working class people voted for the Conservatives. But then on other issues like Brexit, I'm a huge fan of Brexit, as you know. It seems to me that in an alternative universe, the Conservative Party could very easily have gone to the people and said, we got us out of the European Union. Look at this wonderful historic achievement we did, even though it was very tough. You will know that. You were at the coalface of some of the negotiations for a period of time. So it seems that on the one hand, there are things they failed to do, and therefore they couldn't big them up in the public square. And on the other hand, there seems to be a shamefacedness about some of the things they did achieve, or a reluctance to speak about them publicly. Do you think that's a fair assessment? What is it that meant that they weren't able to go to the public and say, look what we have done in the past 14 years?
Yeah, I think it is the lack of achievement. And, of course, the truth is that the 14 years isn't necessarily, I think, always perceived as like the same government the whole time. Boris managed to kind of reset it slightly around 2019. So, therefore, at this election, we're really defending those last 5 years. And that's why, genuine achievements like the improvements in education, for example, reading and writing, didn't get much discussed because it's all kind of already parked and in the past. I think, I struggle to think of anything much that we achieved over the last couple of years, to be honest, in terms of concrete achievements. Okay, we stabilized public finances and began to kind of alter the trajectory slightly of taxes, but that's perceived, rightly or wrongly, that's perceived as a problem that we caused for ourselves. So with Liz Truss, so we don't get any credit for it. There's been the odd thing that's been good, like the university's freedom of speech bill. There's probably one or two other things I could think about if I thought hard. But basically the signature achievements all came in the Boris period. Brexit, Ukraine, and for what everyone thinks about it now, the vaccine rollout and the getting us out of lockdown sooner and quicker than others, however many mistakes were made on the way. And after that, there really hasn't been anything. So I think that's been the fundamental problem. There's been repeated efforts to achieve things. Levelling up hasn't really had any results. There's obviously been immigration has been a huge problem, not just legal but illegal. The repeated bills designed to get a grip on the small boats problem, but failing repeatedly. So I think basically the record is poor. We haven't talked about the extenuating circumstances, and obviously the pandemic is an extenuating circumstance, but we kind of haven't sought to talk about it or defend it in any way, really. This 400 billion of debt has just appeared on the books, and we all have to live with it as if by magic. So that's been part of the problem. And as you say, we haven't defended Brexit. The government has simply not spoken in any positive way about it, with the exception of Kemi. And as a result, most people think Brexit is somehow failing. So it's not surprising that Brexit is a Conservative Party policy. However individual MPs voted on it. It's become associated with the Conservative Party. If people think Brexit's failing, then that's going to bounce back on the Conservative Party. And again, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Just slightly beyond the Tory party, I wanted to ask you about the general election campaigning more broadly. You've mentioned bungee jumping Ed Davey, who every day he was doing some ridiculous stunt in order to get the cameras around him. It became more and more peculiar the longer it went on. Starmer and his camp obviously played it very safe during the election campaign. You could tell that they had an attitude of, let's just not screw anything up and then we'll probably get into Downing Street. It was you could see it in Angela Rayner's face in particular when she was on those TV debates. She wasn't her normal self. She wasn't very colourful and outspoken. She tended to be very careful and very pinched and to be watching her words. So there was a safety element there. But bringing into bear the Tory campaign, the Labour campaign, the Lib Dem campaign, what do you think it tells us about politics more broadly? Because it does feel as though if you were to compare this election campaign to, a campaign of the 60s or the 50s, when there were huge debates about the trade deficit and the economic health of the country and the future of wages and all sorts of issues would have been on the table for substantial discussion. And that doesn't seem to happen anymore. Do you think it's down to the TikTokization of politics? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, we've, 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even a bit more recently than that, was an era of mass politics. Both parties have much bigger memberships than they do now. For Labour, the unions were involved. For the Tories, business and business organisations were perceived as on their side. There were simply many more people and organisations involved in politics and that era has gone, it seems, though Corbyn in 2017 showed that, perhaps he could bring it back if you tried very hard. We'll have to see whether that is possible. But, I think that's the big difference, that public affairs generally, political debate has just got more rarefied. It's conducted amongst an elite. Most people seem to have turned off, and the elite isn't really interested in engaging the people most of the time. And there are rare moments like the Brexit referendum where it suddenly bursts through and people get involved, but generally it doesn't. And if you look at the polling, I think it was YouGov that did it, of which issues cut through during the campaign, which ones could people remember spontaneously. What struck me was simply how low all the figures were. There were very few that got above about 15, 20% of people being able to recall them. Even things that we in the political class think were like major events, like the D-Day event. Even the betting scandal was only getting 25% awareness. So I think most people have turned off. And I do think the length of the campaign is a factor. I'd given up. I'd sort of lost interest by the end. I've got to admit, I think 6 weeks far too long. But the basic problem was the failure to talk about the issues. And to me, one symbolic event was when Keir Starmer said very early on in the campaign that he was a socialist. And I can't imagine 10 years ago. Can you imagine if in the Thatcher era, that she wouldn't have gone at that with everything they've got, and the party wouldn't have gone to, okay, what do you mean by socialist? You're really saying you want to, is that what sort of society do you want? Do you really want the government running industry? Trying to bring in all the negative associations with the word socialist. As it was, it just went by. We didn't really even attempt to criticise him for it very much. It just was not an ideas election. And when it's not an ideas election, you don't get people interested and involved in the same way. You get the Ed Davey, let's grab something on screen. And it is very disappointing, because if we don't find a way of bringing ideas back in and getting people involved and getting people to understand kind of what's at stake, what are the different ways of running society, how could things be better for us, then politics gets done by an elite. And that's what's happening. And people are turning off.
Yeah, that's very well put. It always strikes me that it increasingly feels like we are still technically enfranchised, but politically disenfranchised. So we still have the piece of paper that allows us to choose the government, but we're not really being engaged in the big debates about how the country should be run, what the constitutional makeup of the country should be, what the future should look like. So you do start to ask yourself, well, what's the vote worth if we're not really being engaged at that higher level that we used to be in the past? I wanted to ask you about a bit more on the Conservative Party's relations to reform, or their attitude, rather, to reform. So Nigel Farage's party, Reform, have done well in a pretty short period of time, considering that he only decided to stay in Britain a few weeks ago, having initially said he was going to bugger off to America. He decided to stay, to become leader of Reform and to really run their campaign, and they've done well on the back of that. They're the third largest party in terms of vote share. That's not reflected in their seats in the Commons, which is another big question about how our system works. The Lib Dems have far greater number of seats than Reform, which is worrying, I think. What was the attitude, do you think, amongst the Conservative Party when they knew that Farage was going to come back on board, when they knew Reform as a consequence of that would become a bit more of a threat? Do you think there was just that arrogant approach from the get-go where they just thought, how dare you encroach on our territory? This is our world alone, not yours. Was that the initial response? Was there an element of fear as well, do you think, that they really did think they could lose badly as a consequence of Reform taking some of their votes? What was the Conservative Party attitude to that?
Yeah, I'm afraid that for a lot of Conservative Party politicians, there did seem to be this very de haut en bas patronising attitude to Reform and its voters. And I said overnight in a piece I wrote for the Telegraph that it was like they regarded Reform like the tenantry appearing at the gates of the stately home with their pitchforks, or the sort of stately home staff suddenly deciding to kind of go on strike or disrupt things. Not that they were people with an equal right to be heard in a political arena that's open to everybody in principle. I think it was compounded by the fact that I think the leadership thought we'd caught Reform on the hop with the election, and for a week or two it looked like it. We had. Farage had given up, and then he came back, and I think there was a mood of panic for a couple of weeks, to be honest. Then there was the Ukraine issue and one or two other things that, who knows whether it stalled the rise or whether they reached their natural ceiling. But anyway, that sort of calmed it. But you will still hear, I've heard people today saying, this is the Reform caused this defeat. If it hadn't been for Reform, we lost these seats because of Reform. That is true in a technical sense. If you look at the maths and the majorities and so on, it's not true in a political sense, because we failed to offer to voters what Reform is offering to voters. And obviously a lot of people want that. And that is the basic political mistake we've made. We've moved, we've tilted to the centre left. We've got into this position where what we're offering is not really that different to what everybody else is offering in the mainstream parties, and we vacated what I regard as normal conservatism. The normal ideas that 20 or 30 years ago would have been absolutely mainstream in conservative politics are now regarded as out there, and we have left the territory. And if we're going to win again, we've got to reoccupy that territory.
Yeah, I find the idea that, blasted Reform, how dare they stand in this election? I find it such an extraordinary argument. Essentially what some Conservatives are saying is that if Reform hadn't stood, if they hadn't put up those candidates, we would have done better. But why on earth should a political party take its own candidates off the ballot paper? That seems to me such an extraordinary request to make, or even to hint at. Parties should do what they want to do, and they should fight it out in the public square for the people's votes. When you say that Reform offered voters things that the Conservative Party failed to offer them, what do you mean in relation to that? I mean, I do think Reform's policy proposals, some of them were very interesting. So, for example, the fact that a significant chunk of the public has voted for a party that is very skeptical of net zero, I think is an important turning point potentially in the political life of this country, because we're all supposed to worship the religion of net zero. So I think that's a good example of an issue that has probably got more legs than people think. But what are you thinking of in relation to what reform offered voters that the Tories failed to offer?
So I think that the way forward for mainstream right politics in this country is a mix of free markets in the economic sphere, very broadly, free markets and reform, and revalidating the nation and the government, and establishing proper kind of control, and running the nation, making the British nation state viable again. And I think the reform offered a lot of that. To be specific, net zero is an obvious point of difference. The NHS, I thought it was very interesting the way that both parties actually, though particularly Labour, tried to pin on reform that they were going, they'd got this outlandish policy on the National Health Service. And it didn't really stick, I didn't think. And after 2 or 3 days, everyone gave up trying to make an issue of it. I think there is more appetite to hear that the NHS isn't working well than mainstream parties have digested. If it's broken the taboo on that, brilliant. Immigration, obviously, is an area where our offer was simply not believed. I mean, you could ask whether you could really believe the reform offer either, but you kind of felt the reform wanted to do it. If they failed to achieve what they said in the manifesto, it wouldn't be because they didn't want to do it. It would be because there were genuine obstacles. Whereas, unfortunately for us, so much of it's been, well, they didn't really want to do it, so they didn't really try very hard. And that's a crucial difference. And then the whole culture war thing. We have got into a better position on aspects of it, the trans debate, aspects of women's rights, and so on. But we haven't really taken on the underpinnings. And we've won a couple of tactical victories, but I don't think we've won the war in any way. And we're about to discover that under Labour. So, to me, and finally, tax and spend, obviously, where reform had really quite a radical manifesto. Again, could you totally believe everything in it? I'm not sure, but the aspirations were there. All these things were mainstream Conservative territory 50, 20 years ago. It would have been absolutely normal to talk about controlling the borders, social cohesion, maintaining the nation state, effective government, relatively smaller state, public service reform. There's nothing kind of abnormal about any of this stuff. It's just that we've not offered it, and reform did.
If you're a regular listener to this show or a regular reader of Spiked, why not become a Spiked supporter? Spiked supporters is our thriving community of people who donate to Spiked. Anyone who gives £5 or more a month or £50 or more a year can become a Spiked supporter and get access to lots of exciting perks. Spiked supporters can comment on articles, get free and discounted tickets to events, and bookmark articles as you browse. This is our way of saying thank you to all of you who fund our work. Spiked is completely free, and yet you still hand over your hard-earned cash to make sure that anyone, anywhere can read us and listen to us. We're incredibly grateful for your generosity. If you don't give to Spiked yet, now is the perfect time to start. Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to set up your donation and your Spiked supporters account. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of where reform swooped in and why people appreciated that swooping in, as we've seen in the large number of votes that they got. You've raised two issues there that I did want to specifically ask you about, immigration and the culture war. So firstly, on immigration, it would be remiss of me not to ask you why you think the Conservatives have failed on this, because it's almost immaterial what we as individuals might think about immigration levels. The point is that the Tories said that they would get a handle on it. They know that part of the vote for Brexit, I think the vote for Brexit was predominantly a vote to restore British sovereignty, to return lawmaking to the nation itself. I think that was the real movement behind it. But there was also concern about freedom of movement, uncontrolled immigration, open borders, and so on. And the Conservative Party did promise to get a handle on this stuff, and they just didn't. They just seemed incapable or unwilling, or maybe a combination of the two, to do something about it. What do you think the immigration issue tells us about the contemporary Conservative Party more broadly? What explains those failures, do you think?
I mean, I think there's a lot of things coming together here. I think the good reason for why the initial points-based decision-making on immigration in 20 and 21 were taken was that we didn't know what effect the pandemic was having. A lot of people had left the country. We didn't know whether they were going to come back. It seemed likely there was going to be quite a big economic shock anyway. So err on the side of caution. I don't think that bit of the decision-making was problematic. What was problematic was the failure to adjust and to work out what was actually happening and to bring in controls much more quickly on legal immigration. In fact, we seem to go the other way and relax more and more areas over the last couple of years. You know, we did things that I just find completely baffling, like the fact that you can employ somebody from overseas to quite a wide range of jobs more cheaply than you can employ a Brit. I simply don't understand why we allowed that to be the case. And I think we were caught by, partly the OBR methodology. Is always easier in the short run to keep immigration up. I think part of it was a genuine belief that, in parts of the policymaking establishment, that legal immigration didn't matter. It was a way of boosting productivity. It was a way of helping GDP, despite all the evidence. Our productivity has been worst for a long time in the 15 or 20 years when immigration has been highest. So, it's a case that at least needs to be proven. And yet the establishment seems absolutely captured by it, or has been till recently. So I think all those things went together, plus probably a bit of a feeling that it was a bit culturally insensitive to be too tough on immigration, and it didn't look good, and we shouldn't make too much of it if we didn't have to. I think all those things came together, and we just didn't realize how strongly people felt. And I don't know why we didn't understand that, because it was quite obvious, as you say, really from the referendum campaign. But there it is. I think on small votes and illegal immigration, it's different. We've just failed to get to grips with the problem. The heart of the problem is the international constraints, the ECHR, the web of treaties, the way our courts interpret them, and we were never prepared to get a grip on those things, unfortunately, and we ran out of time, and that's why nobody believed us.
On that aspect of it, which I think is absolutely right, those international barriers to exercising true sovereign control over what happens at your borders, who comes in, and so on. Do you think the Conservative Party's failure on that speaks to a fizzling out of the Brexit spirit, as we might call it, or perhaps to, in more practical terms, a failure of the Conservative Party to appreciate how far the Brexit idea could potentially have gone in terms of not only freeing us from the constraints of being a member of the European Union, but also from the constraints of being tied to various other globalist treaties, laws, institutions, and so on. Because it seems to me that it is very, very interesting, historically speaking, that in the aftermath of a vote to reassert control over our borders and our sovereign territory, the immigration problem got worse for a period of time, and there seemed to be less willingness amongst the political establishment to really get a handle on it. What do you think it tells us about Conservative Party attitudes to Brexit, that failure occurred fairly swiftly after 2016.
Yeah, I think, again, there are a lot of things happening in different directions. It's odd, really. The ECHR itself has only gone mainstream as an issue, really, in the last 18 months, probably. Up to that point, it was a genuinely fringe thing to advocate leaving the ECHR, and it no longer is. So in that sense, the debate has moved along in a way that I didn't quite expect. Obviously, it's not going to happen now. But but against that, the wider background, I think, was that after the supreme effort to get us out in 19 and 20, we kind of just relaxed back into the armchair. It seemed like it had been a lot of trouble. We'd upset a lot of people. There's endless kind of ongoing aggravation and pain over Northern Ireland and fisheries and this sort of thing. And, there was sort of this overwhelming temptation just to kind of relax and try and defuse a few of the things and carry on as before. And then, of course, the Windsor Framework made that worse, because now they've got a lever they can use over us the whole time, having agreed that, do something bad and forget about any of these trading benefits we've given you, supposedly. So I think we all know a lot of the establishment, lots of Conservative establishment, was not hugely committed to Brexit. I think even those that were, some balked at the pain and aggro that was caused by it. And by the middle of this government's term, a lot of people just had enough, and we relapsed. And that's taking on the ECHR and UN conventions and the courts and international law and all of that. It just seemed too much for too many people. I think that's the honest truth. The will wasn't there. Even if Rishi Sunak had got up and said, we're going to overrule the ECHR, we're going to push through this bill, I think it would have been very difficult. The political will just was not there. We ran out of time, and there we are.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. It feels like they ran out of steam and they ran out of time. And as you say, the will wasn't there. And if you don't have the will, then it's not going to happen. Okay, on the culture war then, you said earlier, and I think you're right, that the Conservative Party did start to make some moves on the culture war question, particularly in relation to the trans issue and some other issues too. But it always struck me as odd that the Conservative Party couldn't clock how popular it would have been to take a really more forceful stance against some of this stuff. Because whenever I speak to normal people outside of the kind of circles you and I move in, they are exasperated by this stuff, the trans issue included, but other issues as well, in terms of what's happening in schools, what's happening in universities, the kind of fashionable self-loathing and the hatred for British history, all those things that are fashionable in certain circles but incredibly unpopular amongst ordinary people. It seems to me that the Conservative Party could potentially have cleaned up on some of these questions. What do you think was holding them back from saying things like trans women are not women? Britain is not structurally racist. British history has many wonderful moments. Why couldn't they bring themselves to say those quite commonsensical things?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it's probably that many of the leading figures didn't think that hard about it until quite recently. It just seemed like part of the noise that you had to deal with. It wasn't really what politics should be about. And I guess the fair reason for that is in the Conservative Party, there is still, even nowadays, a bit of a tradition of not interfering in civil society if you can help it. And that probably contributed to letting this get a bit out of hand over the last few years. I think we have a fringe in the party. It's a fairly small fringe, obviously, but the Caroline Noakes, Alicia Kearns type fringe feels extremely strongly about it, and we're willing to make a lot of trouble about the issue. We're quite willing to line up with Labour at critical moments if it became necessary over conversion therapy and so on. So they're kind of trouble-causing ability was quite high, even if they're only really a fringe in the party. I think these sorts of things just went together, that the main leading figures just thought this isn't worth getting involved in, and it only came quite late that they really realised they had to. And I think as much it happened through the free speech issue. I'm not even convinced it was the sort of trans women's rights thing that was the ultimate cause of it. I think it was concerns about the broader free speech debate and what you could say and what you couldn't say that kind of woke them up to the fact that a lot of problematic things were going on here. So it's a confused picture, and it still is confused. I think that's the point. What is a bit discouraging is that the Cass report was mostly excellent, I think, and it's as if it's popped the balloon of the trans issue. All of a sudden it no longer matters, and it shows that if you take these things on, you can win. You can win the arguments, you can deflate the opposition, and people are just looking for a lead. It's a different issue, but very similar in that way was the Section 35 decision with the SNP and their gender recognition law. All of a sudden we took that on, we told the SNP you couldn't do it, and it's like the SNP just collapsed as a party. And that I guess is a big achievement of the last couple of years. So I think it's a mix of various things. It's coming to it late. It's not seeing it as part of the sort of normal politics until quite late, and probably just not being in touch with public opinion and how strongly a lot of people felt, like on immigration, like on so many other things. And once again, it's too late. Yeah.
I think you're right that the collapse of the SNP is a great achievement. I'm sorry if that sounds mean, but I think they had it coming, and it's probably a good thing for the people of Scotland and for the nation of Scotland, which deserves far better than the SNP. Just one more thing on the culture war question. You mentioned Kemi Badenoch earlier. She has often fought a one-woman war against some of these crazy ideas. She's been incredibly strong on the trans question in particular, her defense of not only of women's rights, but also the right of kids not to be interfered with medically and hormonally just because they are not gender conforming or because they are effeminate boys or tomboy girls or whatever else they might be. She's been very good on all of that, and she's had a huge amount of flack. Most recently, the actor David Tennant telling her to shut up, publicly telling her to shut up, which I thought men didn't tend to do anymore, tell women to shut up on a stage, and also saying that he looks forward to the day when she might disappear. In relation to that kind of response that Kemi Badenoch in particular seems to get, she really seems to rile sections of the left. What do you think lies behind that? And do you think, because I want to come on to the question of what the Conservative Party might do next, do you also think that it points to a potential within a figure like Kemi Badenoch, because she is quite assertive and explosive and willing to be conflictual when the conflict is something worth fighting?
Yeah, I think it's good. I'm a big fan of Kemi. I think. What do I think? I think she can come across as quite confrontational, quite aggressive at times in making these arguments. But I think it's as much because nobody else is, so it stands out. And most of our cabinet members have been pretty reticent on most controversial issues most of the time. They're always giving ground. They're always accommodating the other side. They're very rarely willing to say, you're wrong, and I'm telling you, you're wrong. And Kemi is willing to say that, and it does stand out, probably. Maybe one or two occasions she's done it where she didn't have to, but generally I think it is good to push back and make these arguments. I did think it was interesting that, defending herself against David Tennant, she kind of used his arguments back. She sort of accepted some of the premises, which I think is a pity, and shows just how deeply this way of thinking has got into everybody's head nowadays. But I don't really blame her for that. I think it's just the kind of thing you could do without thinking, really. But it's what we need. It's definitely what we're going to need in opposition, is the willing to be aggressive, not personally, but make the arguments and explain why they're wrong and explain why you don't agree. And the more of that, the better, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So in opposition then, the Conservative Party are in opposition. There are younger generations who are unfamiliar with this situation. I've been speaking to a few of them over the past day or so who can have no memory of the Conservatives being in opposition. That's how old people like us are these days. We can remember it. So what do you think? This is really asking you to look into a crystal ball. I appreciate that. But what do you think will become of the Conservatives in opposition? I mean, it seems to me that there are two possibilities, or probably many more. But either a time in opposition is a time to take stock, where you self-analyze. You think, where did we go wrong? How must we improve? Who are we? What are we for? Who do we represent? Those kind of existential questions can often come to the surface when you're forced into a minority position or an opposition position. Or the disarray that we've seen in the Conservative Party over the past few years, including pretty significant splits where it's gone from being what it always was, which was a broad church, to being a very divided church and a kind of often quite conflictual church with One Nation Tories and Wets on one side and Brexiteers and culture warriors on the other. What do you think will become of the Conservatives in opposition? Will they appreciate this time out to get their act together, or could things fray a little bit more?
I mean, it's hard to tell at this stage. It definitely could get worse. It could get better. A lot depends on the decisions that get taken in the next few weeks. I do think it's important to avoid what we did last time, which was too much self-flagellation. That we're bad people, we got a lot of things wrong, that sort of approach. I do think we've got to be saying we've got a good philosophy in terms of conservatism. And in fact, a lot of the rest of the world is turning to it in one form or another. But we kind of lost sight of it. We modernized, we blurred it. We became divided as we brought in people who had too many different opinions. And that's why we ended up where we are. But so I do think there's got to be a bit of going back to our conservative roots if we're going to stabilise things. The other big decision that's going to have to be made, obviously, is how serious are we going to be about uniting the right in some way or other? In our system, we can't win unless the right is united again. And obviously that can be accomplished in different ways. We could merge with Reform, we could become conservative and get our voters back from Reform, or we could choose to go left and effectively leave the right to Reform over the next few years. And if we choose the wrong leader, that is a real possibility. So there are some crucial decisions coming up. And that particular one, do we maintain this standoffish attitude to Reform? Do we attempt to, I mean, the worst of all things would be to kind of maintain that attitude while not willing the end but not willing the means. We'll just end up with further argument and division and us being in the same state in 4 or 5 years' time. There's a lot more, obviously, that needs to be done. We need to get activists back. We need a proper organisation, a campaign headquarters. We need the ability, but most of all, we need to get comfortable about our philosophy again. We need to explain why we think we've got a philosophy that is capable of dealing with the country's problems, or the country's gone down a wrong track, but we know how to get out of it. These are some of the things that need to be done. Being honest about the situation, all of that's got to come. We need to offer a serious, worked through set of alternative propositions in the run up to the next election. And we've got to start doing that now if we're going to be in that position in 3 years' time, given what's happened over the last few years. So there are many things we could fail to do and leave ourselves in just as bad a position as in 3 or 4 years' time as now. And we've got to get a lot of things right to become competitive again. But I think we can do that. But choosing the right leader, choosing the right direction, being clear about the philosophy, those are the crucial things. And we will take decisions in the next few months that make us path dependent for the rest of the parliament. So it's really important we get them right now.
Yeah. Okay, David, my last question for you is about our new government and how you think things might pan out with our new rulers. I feel slightly torn. I mean, I'm against the new government. I think that's pretty clear. But I feel slightly torn on the question of whether they are going to be woke crusaders and make all that stuff a lot worse, which I think will be very bad for the country, or whether they are actually quite technocratic and square and not particularly ideological. And yes, Keir Starmer doesn't really know what a woman is, but does he have it within him to force through lots of new laws that would allow men who claim to be women to go wherever they please? I'm not sure that he does. So I find it difficult to work out, are they going to be zealous moral crusaders, or are they going to be something a bit more boring and square and equally problematic in terms of their legislative agenda, but not necessarily ideological crusaders? What's your take? What are your concerns about the new Starmer government that we're all ruled by?
It is hard to tell at this stage. I mean, the leading figures don't look like revolutionaries, even if some of them have said quite revolutionary and incendiary things at various points in the past. It is really hard to know. They'll have a lot of MPs who want quite radical things to be done, I think, and a lot of MPs who will be at a loose end and kind of want, because there just won't be enough jobs, and will be pushing their own favoured causes. We don't really know how the fact that there's still a significant left of the party will play out. Will the big majority mean Starmer can ignore them, or will it mean that they feel comfortable making trouble because there's so much room for manoeuvre? There's a lot of things we just don't know, because it's so long since we've had a Labour government. I tend to think, I must say, that it will be on the side of, the more aggressive, the more difficult side, because it's just the way they see the world. I think they may not realise how controversial some of the things they want to do actually are until they're past and hit reality. The whole sort of race, group rights, this race equality bill, the socio-economic duty, I think, stuff like that, I think they just see as normal and don't realise that a lot of people don't see it as normal. There are sort of big culture war things coming down, like, further decisions on abortion, the euthanasia voluntary end of life stuff, all this sort of thing, where, they generally have a very sort of, secular, unreflective, utilitarian view of a lot of these questions, and I don't think they necessarily realise the reaction. And that, in the economic sphere too, their approach is to regulate, to control, to tell people what to do, to know better. So I think those sort of instincts will lead them into more controversial territory that they will try to push through and cause problems. That's my guess, but it is only a guess, obviously, at this stage.
David, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks a lot.